What if the most dangerous sound in the galaxy was not a battle cry, but the moment an entire species stopped speaking? What if humanity disappeared for 100 years, and every empire alive made the fatal mistake of calling that silence defeat? And before we go any further, do me a favor. Tap like if you love stories where patience becomes power. Subscribe if epic sci-fi is your thing. And share this with the one friend who always says humanity would never stay down. The last message sent out of human space did not beg for help. It did not ask for mercy. It did not warn the enemy that revenge was coming, because revenge spoken too early can become a promise you fail to keep. The last message was short, cold, and strange enough that alien translators argued about it for decades. It came from a command relay buried under the shattered crust of Luna while Earth burned under orbital fire. The message said, "Record the debt." Then the signal ended. For the next 100 years, nothing came back. No distress calls, no ambassadors, no refugee fleets asking for sanctuary, no speeches to the Galactic Assembly, no pirate chatter in old human codes, no military traffic, no cargo schedules, no weak little pockets of survivors screaming into the void about what had been done to them. Humanity did not cry. Humanity did not explain. Humanity did something far more upsetting. Humanity vanished. Later, when the galaxy tried to tell the story in polite language, they called it the Sol reduction. They called it a regrettable frontier correction. They called it a tragic consequence of unstable diplomacy. They buried 16 billion dead under phrases so clean they almost sounded sterile. But clean words could not change what happened. The round dominion had not attacked in rage. Rage would have made it messy. Rage would have left room for mistake, hesitation, or pity. The round war machine came in perfect formation, with legal notices already drafted and supply chains planned down to the hour. Their ships dropped from fold at the blind angle of Sol's outer defense net, a point so precise that later military academies would study it with the kind of admiration only monsters mistake for intelligence. They knew where the human listening buoys were. They knew the delay in Earth's orbital shield rotations. They knew which colonies had defense fleets and which only pretended to. They knew how long it would take for Mars Command to realize Luna Command was dead. They knew the exact psychological value of striking Earth and the colonies at the same time. So they did. The first 6 minutes erased the human navy from history. Orbital docks above Mars were cut open like fruit. Titan's carrier yard turned into a ring of expanding gas. The Europa defense shell fired exactly once before its firing lattice folded inward and flash froze every crew deck. On Earth, cities never saw the ships themselves. They only saw the sky bloom white, then silver, then a kind of terrible violet that meant the upper atmosphere was cooking. Then came the quieter weapon. The Round called it a civic dampener. That name still makes historians sick. It did not kill directly. It strangled coordination. It shattered quantum relay coherence across human space and flooded every communication band with a wave pattern so dense that high-order systems collapsed under their own correction loops. Long-range channels died first, then military mesh, then civilian emergency nets, then local command webs. Every voice system that allowed billions of people to act like one civilization stopped working in layers, as if an unseen hand was pinching out candles one room at a time. A species can survive damage. It struggles to survive isolation. That was the real strike. By the time the wider galaxy understood the scale of the assault, Earth had already lost contact with 12 colony worlds, 4 shipyards, and more than 200 habitats. The Assembly received partial footage, broken casualty estimates, pleas from human diplomats who had no fleets left to represent, and a final flood of uncategorized panic from civilians whose transmission packets were cut mid-sentence. Then even that stopped. The emergency session of the Galactic Assembly opened 11 standard days later. 48 species sent representatives. 18 spoke. 17 urged caution. 9 suggested mediation. 5 requested more evidence, as if burning planets were a matter that could improve under additional review. 3 openly argued that humanity had provoked the war by industrializing too fast near round trade space. Only one delegation called it what it was. The Neri. The Neri were an old pelagic species from the water world Iskar Vale, a people who moved slowly, spoke carefully, and almost never interrupted anyone. Their ambassador, Sarat of the Ninth Current, waited until the chamber had exhausted itself with procedural cowardice. Then she rose, every ribbon of bioluminescence on her body going dark. In Neri culture, darkness was grief. She said, if you refuse to act because the crime is expensive to oppose, then understand what you are voting on. Not neutrality, permission. No one in the chamber answered her directly. The resolution to intervene failed. The assembly justified itself the way institutions always do when they confuse fear with wisdom. Open war with the Round Dominion, they said, would destabilize 7 trade sectors. It would risk retaliatory cleansing campaigns against weaker member species. It might fracture old treaties. It might awaken older wars. The human state, they said, was already functionally collapsed. To escalate now would save too few and cost too much. The official record used the phrase unacceptable strategic burden. 16 billion human beings became a burden on paper. The Round expected the rest to be easy. Their models predicted that scattered survivors, cut off from each other and stripped of industrial capacity, would fall into one of 4 patterns within 20 years. Extinction, tribal fragmentation, religious breakdown, feudal regionalism. They had historical examples for all of them. They had broken other civilizations before. Smaller ones, yes. Slower ones, yes. But the pattern held. When you cut the head off a species and blind the body flails, then dies. And for a while, the models looked correct. Human space went dark. The border pickets round left near former human routes saw nothing. Their spy nets heard almost nothing worth recording. A mining platform here, gone cold. A colony ark there, drifting. A distress buoy broadcasting old civilian medical requests into dead channels. There were some signs of movement in the first 3 years. Isolated convoys running without proper tags, strange mass signatures near abandoned belts, a few stolen Round components traced to black markets, but nothing that suggested coordinated survival. 10 years after the massacre, the Dominion reclassified humanity from active threat to residual species. 30 years after, they called humanity a diminishing demographic. 50 years after, human affairs became an appendix in frontier reports. 70 years after, junior analysts treated old war files about Earth the way board students treat forgotten empires. 100 years after, most of the galaxy believed humanity existed only as ruins, folk memory, and cautionary lesson. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was assuming silence means stillness. Because while the Round looked outward, congratulating themselves on decisive strategy, the surviving humans had made a decision so ugly, so disciplined, and so hard that almost no other species would have chosen it. They decided not to answer pain with noise. They answered with subtraction. They abandoned glory first. No flags, no old nations, no debates over which government in exile had the rightful seal of Earth, no sentimental last stands for symbolic worlds, no attempt to retake famous ground just because the names hurt to lose. Symbolism, the surviving admirals decided, had nearly gotten the species killed. Emotion would be preserved but not obeyed. So they cut away everything that made them easy to predict. The first convergence took place in fragments. A submarine pen under the ice of Enceladus exchanged laser pulses with a maintenance nest inside the bones of a dead ore station. A hospital ship hiding in the magnetic shadow of a gas giant relayed population counts to a convoy of civilian transports whose transponders had been melted off by hand. On a research moon with no atmosphere and too little gravity for comfort, 3 schoolteachers, 2 engineers, a navigation AI specialist, and 1 injured Marine used antique optical gear to bounce a packet of coordinates across 43 million kilometers of dark. The packet reached its first destination 12 months later. It said only this: "If you are alive, move without witnesses. Bring children, tools, seeds, records, and every machine that still makes other machines." No one signed it. That was enough. Humanity did not gather in one place. That would have been suicide. It gathered in patterns. The first hidden settlements were built inside regions every major power considered strategically worthless. Dust knots where sensors saw too much noise. Rogue moons with unstable magnetic storms. Mineral-poor dead systems that held no water worth stealing and no biospheres worth settling. Human planners searched for places that offended imperial imagination. If an empire could not profit from it, it usually did not think someone else might survive there. So humans chose the useless places. They carved pressure vaults into iron asteroids and lined them with stolen insulation foam. They powered life support from fusion plants assembled out of mining cores and cannibalized freighters. They dismantled beautiful civilian ships because elegance reflected too much heat. And memory wasted mass. They relearned how to grow food in stacked trays, how to recycle every gram of water, how to patch hull fractures with printed ceramics and prayerless hands. Entire communities learned to treat silence like air discipline. Babies were soothed before they cried near listening metal. Machines were wrapped, floated, muffled, hidden. And because humans were still human, they did something else at the same time. They kept records, not just of the dead, of recipes, idioms, playground songs, bad jokes, wedding customs, street maps, fragments of old movies, how rain had smelled in Lagos, how cold metal felt on subway poles in winter, how mango tasted on a summer market day in Manila, how traffic sounded in Sao Paulo at dusk, how children on Earth once drew rings around Saturn in school notebooks as if it belonged to them. They kept everything they could because extinction does not begin when bodies die. It begins when memory becomes negotiable. In one hidden archive station, a woman named Mara Sarin spent 16 years cataloging oral histories from survivors who had been children during the attack. She recorded them in every language she could preserve, then again in simplified trade speech, then again in mathematical metadata designed to outlive linguistics if it had to. She saved contradictions on purpose, saved grief in all its inaccurate forms, saved the ways people misremembered sunlight, because even false memory told the truth about what was missing. Elsewhere, in ship caverns with names never written on exterior hulls, another generation was being shaped by a harsher task. They were taught patience, not passive patience, weaponized patience. A child born in the dark settlements did not grow up hearing that the enemy had won. They grew up hearing numbers, population lost, worlds burned, fleets erased, civilizations that watched and did nothing. They learned astronomy beside casualty ledgers. They learned engineering from wreckage. They learned that grief could be indulged in private but must be useful in public. Every airlock, every ration valve, every railgun coil, every seed vault, every line of code existed because someone had chosen not to die quietly. If this story is pulling you in, leave a blue flame in the comments, hit subscribe, and share this with a friend who loves slow burn payoffs. By the 20th year of silence, the hidden network had names for itself, though most were spoken only inside sealed rooms. The vaults kept culture. The kilns built industry. The veil handled movement and concealment. The ledger tracked the dead and, eventually, the living who would answer for them. And at the center of it all, though even center was too simple a word, stood a rotating command lattice called Hearthline. Hearthline was not a planet, not a station in the ordinary sense. and not anything the realm would have recognized as a capital. It was distributed across 9 habitats, 32 mobile foundries, and a ghosted computation cloud hidden in the thermal chaos of a brown dwarf system far outside cataloged trade corridors. No one ship contained the whole government. No one node contained the whole war plan. If one part died, the others kept breathing. That design choice came from Admiral Ilya Venn. He had been a logistics officer before the massacre, which is exactly why he mattered after it. The galaxy liked heroes with flags, speeches, and impossible charges into gunfire. Humanity, after Saul, learned to trust quartermasters, systems planners, and people boring enough to ask what happened if 3 things failed at once. Venn had escaped Mars by accident. The cruiser carrying his command staff had been blown off vector, lost its long-range comms, and drifted for 8 months with a skeleton crew before a civilian tug brought them into cover. By the time he regained a picture of what had happened, Earth was gone as a governing center. The colonies were burning, and most of the leaders senior to him were dead. He did not try to become a symbol. He became a method. Under Venn's architecture, every surviving human enclave was asked one question: what can you do better than anyone else? The answer determined its future. If a habitat had metallurgical expertise, it became a forge. If it had biologists and clean tanks, it became an agricultural vault. If it housed linguists, mathematicians, and patient minds, it became a listening post. If it had pilots who knew smuggling lanes and cowardly people would have called criminals, it became a movement cell. Talent stopped following prestige. Prestige followed need. This was how a wounded species did something astonishing. It became efficient. The old human world had been brilliant but messy, competitive, loud, redundant in foolish ways and vulnerable in elegant ones. After the massacre, humanity stripped itself down to ugly essentials. No branch got funding because of politics. No ship class survived because it looked impressive on parade. No research project continued because tradition made it sacred. If something did not feed, hide, move, build, teach, or kill when required, it waited. The waiting changed them. By year 25, hidden yards were printing hulls from carbon lattice foam stronger than most assembly armor by weight. By year 30, human engineers had rebuilt fold drives in compact forms too unstable for peacetime regulators, but perfect for ships that never intended to be inspected. By year 37, the first true shadow frigates entered service. Small, black, heat-throttled predators designed not to win fleet engagements, but to exist beneath notice until the exact second they no longer needed to. Then intelligence matured. This may have been the most important transformation of all. Most species spy loudly. They bribe ministers, steal prototypes, intercept official channels, crack codes, and call it deep tradecraft. Humans did those things too when possible, but their best advantage came from understanding a universal weakness. Large powers talk to themselves constantly. The Round Dominion believed security was a matter of encryption and clearance tiers. Human listeners understood security was also a matter of boredom, pride, routine, and habit. Supply clerks cut corners. Patrol captains repeated routes. Mid-level commanders gossiped over supposedly isolated channels. Engineers complained about procurement defects. Colonial administrators falsified output data to avoid punishment. Politicians leaked to hurt rivals. Families of officers spoke carelessly. None of these fragments looked decisive by themselves. Together, over decades, they formed a living map. The human listening web began with passive optics and crude traffic analysis. It ended with something far more dangerous: context. They learned how the realm promoted commanders. They learned which houses in the Dominion hated each other but smiled in public. They learned which admirals drank, which lied, which hesitated, which loved their children enough to be predicted. They learned where frontier garrisons were underfunded, where munitions were stored, where defense grids had been deferred for budget reasons. where anti-fold nets took exactly 7 minutes to synchronize after maintenance cycles, and which judges in Dominion courts had signed the legal doctrines that justified cleansing campaigns as stability operations. All of it went into the ledger. The ledger was not just a list of crimes. It was a civilization-sized memory engine. Every officer who gave an order during the Saul massacre, every industrial concern that profited from human colony seizures, every assembly delegate who voted to abstain and then cashed the peace dividend, every shipmaster who transported labor from conquered human stations, every news organ that called the dead aggressive expansionists after their homes were ash. The ledger did not care whether guilt wore a uniform or robes or an investment crest. It recorded debt, and when it could, it added location. One of the people who helped turn the ledger from archive into instrument was a woman named Leora Vale. She was born 43 years after the massacre on a station that rotated so slowly you could feel the difference between morning and night in your bones. Her father repaired oxygen scrubbers. Her mother taught languages no one outside the hidden network still spoke daily. Leora showed two unusual gifts very early. She remembered everything she heard, and she did not emotionally react to information until long after everyone else had panicked. Such children are dangerous in hard times. By 16, she was helping decode round legal speech. By 23, she could predict which colonial minister would receive promotion packets based on cargo movements 6 sectors away. By 30, she was quietly running the deepest human analysis cell ever assembled. Vale hated the word revenge, not because she was moral, because it was sloppy. Revenge is what people call a feeling when they are too impatient to build consequences, she told her analysts once. They built consequences. Humanity also rebuilt its military, but not in the way old admirals would have imagined. They knew they could not outnumber the realm. They might never outnumber any major power again, so they abandoned the dream of symmetric war. There would be no grand mirrored fleets with proud battle lines and patriotic music. There would be no attempt to copy the enemy's scale. Instead, human doctrine evolved around 3 principles. See without being seen. Decide the shape of contact. Make the first irreversible event belong to you. From those principles came ships the galaxy would later describe with half-fearful, half-religious language. Wraith cutters, ash lances, coffin carriers, whisper cruisers. The names varied because no one except their crews knew official designations, and most crews preferred it that way. Our hulls were ugly. That was deliberate. Clean lines reflected too predictably. Human warships became broken geometry, angles within angles, heat veils layered under ablative skin, radiator fins that folded into false debris signatures, engine baffles that bled energy through ceramic fog. They hid in comet tails, rode waste fields, ghosted inside convoy clutter, and sat motionless in dead systems for months at a time when training required it. Their weapons were worse. Human engineers studied round shielding and concluded that every empire had made the same philosophical mistake. They treated defense as a contest of strength. Stronger field, stronger armor, stronger counterfire. Humanity chose interruption instead. Rather than smashing barriers head-on, they designed systems that broke timing, coherence, and local certainty. Phase shear torpedoes arrived half a microsecond wrong and made shields collapse trying to reconcile impossible geometry. Filament mines waited dormant until they felt the exact resonance of round military reactors, then unfolded wire webs hotter than fusion cores. Compression darts did not explode. They created localized stress spikes so violent that internal compartments imploded before outer armor registered a hit. And still, all of that was only preparation. Because the deepest project in the dark was not a weapon. It was a choice deferred. Around year 60, once the population had stabilized and hidden industry could support something larger than survival, The inner council faced the question everyone had been living toward. When the time came, what exactly was humanity trying to do? There were voices, especially among the oldest survivors, who wanted extinction answered with extinction. They had watched children die in sealed corridors. They had listened to emergency traffic until the channels melted into static. They did not speak carelessly when they said the round should be erased. Their hatred was not theatrical. It was exhausted, factual, and earned. There were other voices who argued the opposite. If humanity rebuilt itself only to become a cleaner version of the thing that had tried to erase it, then the species would survive biologically while dying morally. These people were not weak. Most had buried as much as anyone else. But they understood another kind of danger. A civilization can win the war it prepares for and still lose the future it needed that war to protect. The debate lasted 9 years. It happened in secure chambers, in slow packets between hidden nodes, in classrooms where children were asked what kind of world they wanted to inherit, and in foundries where workers voted on whether more tonnage should go to colony tools or shipbuilders. Humanity did not drift toward its answer. It dragged itself there. The final doctrine was written in language so plain it scared people. We will become impossible to kill. We will become impossible to ignore. We will not become what was done to us. This did not mean mercy, it meant boundaries. The purpose of the rebuilt fleet would be compulsion, not slaughter. The purpose of the ledger would be accountability, not indiscriminate bloodletting. The purpose of returning would not be to scream at the galaxy for pity. It would be to create a moment so undeniable that every civilization in known space would have to choose, publicly and in full view, whether law meant anything when the victims were not strong enough to enforce it. In other words, humanity decided that when it came back, it would not ask for justice. It would arrive carrying leverage. That decision shaped the next 40 years. Population grew, though never as fast as old-world demographers would have liked. Children born in dark habitats did not have easy lives. Even with advances in medicine and closed-loop agriculture, every settlement lived with limits pressing against the skin of daily existence. A misaligned valve could still kill a neighborhood. A fungal bloom in a protein vat could force ration cuts for months. Fold travel remained expensive and dangerous for ships built in secrecy. Some stations died entirely, their names preserved only in migration records and memorial airlocks. But the species held. Then it thickened. By year 65, there were more than 1 billion humans alive in the hidden network, and the peripheral colonies secretly retaken beyond assembly notice. By year 70, human manufacturing output, though dispersed, matched the level of a mid-tier assembly power in all categories that mattered for war. By year 78, they had established silent footholds in systems once considered permanently lost. By year 81, the first generation born after the massacre held command positions over ships their grandparents could not have imagined. And still the galaxy heard nothing. The only outsiders who guessed the truth were the Neri. Sarat of the Ninth Current had not forgotten her warning in the assembly chamber. She spent decades paying for it politically. Her speeches were archived, cited, and ignored. Neri trade privileges were quietly cut in some Dominion sectors. Invitations to major treaty circles arrived late or not at all. The price of being correct too early is usually isolation. But Sarat had not become old by confusing isolation with failure. The Neri were a patient species from a patient world. They understood currents, hidden pressures, and what masses of water could do while appearing still. They noticed oddities others missed. Freight contracts near dead systems that yielded no profit but continued anyway. Sensor ghosts that repeated with statistical intent. Tiny deviations in border patrols where round ships avoided regions their maps still called empty. Missing pirate bands last seen near former human routes. Fragments. Never enough for proof, more than enough for intuition. So Sarat did something almost no one outside her species knew. She left doors unlocked. Not literally, diplomatically. A port authority here instructed to inspect less aggressively. A maritime archive there indexed under old naming standards humans still used. Weather satellites along nary trade water routes left broadcasting on legacy optical bands. No messages were sent. No alliance was declared. The Neri did not hand humanity victory. They did something smaller and perhaps more important. They made it slightly easier for the forgotten to keep existing. Years later, when Sarat was close to the end of her service, a signal reached her private observatory on Iskar Vale. It came through 3 relay deaths, 2 abandoned weather mirrors, and a refracted laser bounce off the rings of a gas giant, no chart associated with either species. It contained no code flag she could prove in court, no sender line, no tactical data. It contained a single sentence. We noticed the unlocked doors. Sarat read it once, then submerged herself in the cold chamber pools for an entire hour before speaking to anyone. She knew 2 things at once. Humanity lived, and when it eventually moved, the galaxy would not be prepared. Back in the hidden network, Admiral Venn did not live to see the return. That mattered. Great projects are often poisoned by founders who cannot bear to let younger people finish them differently. Venn understood this. He spent his final decade dismantling his own cult before it could harden. He refused statues, refused the title of First Marshal, distributed authority even wider, forced war games where junior commanders were required to prove his favorite assumptions wrong, demoted officers who agreed with him too quickly, promoted those who showed calm under contradiction. When he died at 91, his ashes were not placed in some heroic vault. They were mixed into composite used for the interior wall of a training hall where new cadets learned orbital mechanics and casualty ethics in the same room. The inscription on the wall was his only epitaph. Build systems that do not need your ghost. One of those cadets, many years later, would carry humanity back into the light. Her name was Commander Sana Cade. She was born on a transport dock cut into the side of a drifting nickel iron mountain so large children called it the hanging world. Her first memory was not of a bedroom or a city. It was a vibration, distant industrial rhythm traveling through the walls as massive printers worked in sealed caverns nearby. Her mother ran fuel accounting for fold-capable ships. Her father taught practical history, which in the hidden network meant something harder than dates. He taught decisions. Why this route instead of that route? Why some people were evacuated and others not? Why one station vented its atmosphere rather than allow boarding? Why a convoy abandoned 4 damaged haulers to save 80,000 refugees on the rest? Cade learned young that tragedy becomes propaganda when stripped of trade-offs. She also learned that every adult around her was carrying pain like a second skeleton. That does something to a child. It can break them, or it can teach them to read what is not being said. Cade became terrifyingly good at that. In training, she was not the strongest pilot or the finest shot. She was the best at interpreting silence. During simulation combat, she noticed when an opposing commander delayed 1 beat too long before committing reserves. In negotiations, she caught the difference between a threat and a bluff by the breathing patterns in translated speech. During blind maneuvers, she could infer ship positions from gaps in sensor noise. Her instructors called it intuition until the day one of them reviewed her performance logs and said the more accurate word. Attention. A civilization had spent decades teaching itself to pay attention. Cade was what that training looked like when embodied. By 42, she commanded a Black Hull strike carrier named Quiet Harbor, though calling it a carrier misled more. Then it explained. Quiet Harbor deployed drones, knife frigates, boarding pods, intelligence shells, and humanitarian modules in equal measure. It could hit a warship, disappear behind debris scatter, and deploy field hospitals before the target's second escort understood what had happened. It represented the shape of the new human military perfectly, violent when required, but designed around control rather than spectacle. Cade did not expect to become the face of the return. No one expected it, in fact, until the meeting in the deep chamber beneath Hearthline, where the final question was settled. When do we stop waiting? The answer came not from anger, but math. Leora Vale and her analysts presented a convergence model assembled over 19 years. It tracked Dominion political decay, assembly complacency, generational turnover in both systems, hidden human readiness, and the rare alignment of symbolic opportunity with strategic advantage. The round officer caste responsible for Saul was aging. Some were dead. Many were retired into advisory roles they thought protected them from consequence. The Dominion Senate was split between expansionists and austerity blocs. Border deployments were thinner than they had been in half a century. The wider assembly had become even more hollow, rich on centuries of peace purchased by the suffering of peripheral species. And most crucially, the next grand convocation would be hosted on Iskar Vale under Neri ceremonial law. That mattered because Neri ceremonial law made open violence in the summit chamber a permanent civil stain recognized across hundreds of treaty frameworks. Humanity could arrive with the means to destroy, and dare the galaxy to force it. Vale's final slide in the chamber contained no charts, only a line of text. If we wait longer, some of the guilty will escape judgment through time. If we move sooner, we arrive weaker than the moment deserves. No one argued after that. The return date was set. Everything accelerated quietly. Production vaulted. Crews rotated through live-fire drills under total blackout conditions. Archive divisions cross-checked the ledger until duplicate corroboration existed for every name that would be publicly spoken. Diplomatic cells drafted demands in 32 legal traditions, so no species could pretend not to understand them. Biologists prepared seed vault expansion for reclaimed worlds. Engineers assembled environmental restoration packages. Tribunal theorists built frameworks for interspecies atrocity law, because if humanity forced a reckoning and then had no mechanism for justice, the whole century of discipline would rot into theater. At the same time, the military did what militaries must always do before history arrives. It planned for failure. What if the Dominion opened fire at the summit? What if the Assembly panicked? What if the Neri withdrew support under pressure? What if hidden human positions were exposed on approach? What if half the fleet was lost before transmission? What if public revelation triggered preemptive strikes across surviving human populations elsewhere? What if the species finally stepped out of the dark and found that the galaxy preferred the myth of human extinction to the burden of human return? Every scenario received a branch. Every branch received counters. Every counter received logistics. This was the part storytellers usually skip, because inventory, redundancy, and rehearsed grief do not sound dramatic. But drama is often just preparation meeting a witness. In the final year before the return, children in the hidden habitats noticed something the adults tried to hide. People smiled less. Not because hope was failing, because hope was becoming specific. A little girl on Station Cinder asked her grandmother why everyone kept checking doors that were already locked. The grandmother, who had once escaped a burning orbital school by climbing down a maintenance cable with 32 other children tied to her waist, answered honestly. Because when a long wait ends, she said, your hands need something to do. Humans are not built to hold tension for a century and remain unchanged. Across the network, people began visiting memory vaults at higher rates. They borrowed old Earth music in languages they did not speak. They requested archived street footage from cities that had become myth. Some asked for the names of relatives they had never met. Others asked not to know. Marriages happened faster. Feuds ended abruptly. More volunteers stepped forward than the command lattice could use. Some from duty. Some from curiosity. Some because they wanted to see the faces of the species that had discussed their dead like accounting losses. Quick pause, if you're still with me. Like the video so the algorithm knows this kind of story matters. subscribe for more HFY, and share it with someone who thinks silence is weakness. The fleet assembled in stages so dispersed that no outside observer ever saw a fleet assembling. Ships moved under scrap signatures, under storm cover, under the traffic wash of trade lanes they never entered. Some were towed as inert hulks. Some rode folded inside heavier carriers. Some departed years early and waited in dead systems with crews cycling through meditation drills and maintenance tasks to keep nerves from combusting. When the final count locked, humanity had not built the largest armada in known space. It had built the most deliberate one. 287 combat vessels, 84 support ships, 12 environmental recovery arcs, 9 tribunal archives, 41 medical carriers, 7 diplomatic corps. One message. The message would not be delivered by a politician. It would be delivered by Cade. This decision caused argument. Some wanted an elder survivor. Some wanted Leora Vale because no one understood the debt more completely. A few even wanted Sarat of the Neri to introduce humanity back into galactic awareness, so the first voice the Assembly heard would be one it already trusted. Cade rejected all of those proposals for the same reason. If we lead with grief, she said, they will pity us. If we lead with intellect, they will debate us. If we lead with borrowed legitimacy, they will pretend we were invited. We were not invited. We endured. I should be there because I was born after the massacre. They need to see what their decision created. No one had a better argument. The convoy entered Neri approach space 11 hours before the Grand Convocation opened. Neri Outer Defense Systems saw them, tagged them, and by prearranged silence, did not challenge. Instead, Iskar Vale began adjusting ceremonial biolumens inside the assembly tide chamber far below the ocean surface, where the summit would meet. The Neri built their great political hall within living coral towers under shallow filtered light. It was a place designed to remind air-breathing species that they were visitors inside another rhythm. Sound traveled differently there. Anger felt smaller. Time felt heavier. Perfect for what came next. The round delegation arrived last, exactly as protocol and vanity both demanded. High Strategos Talvin Reese led them. Reese had not participated in the Saul massacre personally. He had been a junior at HFY then, but his rise depended on defending its legacy. He belonged to the school of Dominion thought that insisted harsh force prevented worse instability later. He believed history favored nerve. He believed weaker species required examples. He believed the assembly was a theater of frightened herbivores who mistook procedure for civilization. Most of all, he believed humanity was dead enough to be politically useful and alive enough only to serve as warning. He expected a routine summit. Trade friction, border arguments, one meaningless memorial to extinct humans perhaps, then a banquet, then departure. Instead, as delegates settled and translation fields warmed, the chamber lights dimmed beyond ceremony into something else. Talvin Reese looked up. Above the transparent upper vault of the tide chamber, where soft ocean light should have rippled, dark shapes hung motionless against the pale water glow. Not fish. Not Neri structures. Ships. Hundreds of them. Silent, black, and close enough that even species unfamiliar with human design understood one terrible fact immediately. Those vessels had entered defended summit space without permission. And if they could do that, every assumption in the room had just died. For a few seconds, the chamber broke into chaos so pure, it almost became silence again. Translators lagged under overlapping alarm speech. Delegates reached for secure lines that refused to sync. Neri security did not advance, which was perhaps the most frightening detail of all. The round aides nearest Reese froze between protocol and panic. Some assembly species physically lowered themselves toward the floor in ancestral fear postures dating back to predators they had evolved beside on homeworlds now far away. Then the center dais lit. Sarat of the ninth current moved forward through blue water light, ancient now, slower than she had once been, but carrying herself with the calm of someone who had waited a century for everyone else to catch up. She did not take the main speaking ring. She stopped beside it. That choice landed harder than any announcement. It meant the floor belonged to someone else. The woman who stepped into the light looked, to most of the chamber, unimpressive. She was human, of course, but smaller than the round expected, lean from ship gravity rather than ceremonial training, dressed in a dark uniform with no medals and only one visible emblem at the throat, a simple circle crossed by a single horizontal mark. Some later said it represented a horizon. Some said it represented a debt line on a ledger. Cade never explained it. She looked at the chamber the way a surgeon looks at a table before deciding where to cut. "My name is Sana Cade," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and carried cleanly through the translation field. "I speak for the continuance of humanity. We are present. We are organized. We are armed. And we have come to settle an old account." No one moved. You could feel the room recalculating. Talvin Reese stepped forward first, mostly because people like him are built out of reflex and hierarchy. If they do not claim the center quickly, they suspect the center may never return to them. "You enter protected summit space with an undeclared war fleet," he said. "This is an act of aggression." Cade looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "Aggression was what your Dominion did to Saul. This is called arrival." If Reese felt the hit, he did not show it. Humanity has no recognized state status in the Assembly. Then the Assembly has been out of date for 100 years. A few delegates actually flinched at that, because the sentence did more than reject protocol. It exposed the chamber as irrelevant unless it adapted in real time. Cade lifted one hand. Behind her, the upper water vault shifted. The dark hulls hanging over the tide chamber brightened along precise seam lines, not enough to glare, just enough for every military mind in the room to grasp scale and orientation. They had not come as a symbolic escort. They had come with firing solutions. Then the chamber's central hollow field blossomed. Worlds appeared. Earth first. Not as it had been in tourist archives, as it was at the end of the bombardment. Atmospheric fires, broken ring stations, dead cloud swirls over drowned coastlines, then Mars, then Titan, then outlying colony habitats, agricultural cylinders, shipyards, schools, hospitals, a child refuge dome on Ceres split open to vacuum, a rail terminal on Ganymede lit with impact blooms, civilian records, military records. Captured round recordings cross-indexed against human casualty maps. The sequence was not edited for sensation. That made it worse. Nothing was dramatized. Everything was corroborated. At the bottom of the projection, numbers kept climbing. Civilian dead. Military dead. Missing. Displaced. Infrastructure eradicated. Ecologies destabilized. Cultural archives lost. Reese tried once to interrupt. He stopped when a second screen opened beside the first and showed Dominion orders bearing clear legal seals. The room learned a new kind of quiet. Cade let the images run just long enough to become unbearable. Then she ended them. 100 years ago, she said, your government called this stabilizing action. This chamber called it an unacceptable strategic burden. Many of you hoped time would turn murder into history. Time did not help you. It helped us. She touched the speaking ring, and a new document appeared in the air. Columns, names, dates, ranks, coordinates. The ledger. This record contains the command chain of the Saul massacre, Cade said. It includes fleet officers, legal authorizers, logistics directors, colonial profiteers, media instruments of denial, and those assembly delegates whose votes and trade accommodations enabled the continuation of extermination operations after the initial strike. It includes current status where known. It includes evidence thresholds exceeding the burden of proof in 17 major legal traditions and 300 local frameworks. Copies have already been transmitted to every delegation present, to neutral archives beyond this system, and to distributed Deadman caches that will release automatically if my fleet is attacked. Several delegates looked down at the tablets blooming alive on their desks. One fainted. That detail was omitted from most later official retellings, but witnesses remembered it with satisfaction. There is something useful about power learning it still has a body. Reese did not look at his tablet immediately. Smart or stubborn, perhaps the same thing. "What do you want?" he asked. Everyone in the room already knew this was the only real question. Cade answered without flourish. "Recognition first. The Assembly will enter into binding record that the destruction of Saul and associated campaigns constituted genocide, not conflict escalation, not reduction, not frontier correction, genocide. The Assembly will also enter into record that its refusal to intervene was a moral failure with material consequences." She raised one finger. "Second, the Round Dominion will withdraw from all occupied human worlds and stations, release all archived human property and biological holdings, transfer restoration resources for a period of 50 standard years, and recognize human sovereignty over pre-war and recoverable settlement zones." A second finger. "Third, every individual in the ledger whose evidence file meets prosecution standard for planning, authorizing, profiting from, or directly executing extermination action will be surrendered to an interspecies tribunal." A third finger. Her hand fell. "These are terms, not an opening conversation." Talvin Reese made the mistake empires always make when they feel the old ground slipping. He smiled. Not because he was amused, because he was buying himself half a second. "And if we refuse?" Cade's expression did not change. "Then the galaxy learns whether the Round Dominion can survive the loss of its 12 most important military nodes in the first 13 minutes of open hostilities." The hollow field changed again. This time it showed Dominion space. Shipyards, reactor wells, Senate transit rings, data cores, anti-fold gates, fuel reservoirs, deep command bunkers, all marked. Not approximately marked. Precisely. Even delegates who hated humanity in that moment understood what they were seeing. The century of silence had not been empty. It had been an intelligence operation so complete it bordered on invasion by other means. Reese looked at the map and, for the first time, betrayed emotion. It was tiny, a tightening near the eyes, a shift in the jaw, but it was there. Cade saw it. So did everyone else. "You have been inside our systems," he said quietly. "We have been paying attention," she replied. That line would later race across 1,000 networks in 100 languages. But in the room, it landed like a verdict. Saret finally spoke then, her voice moving through the tide chamber like a cold current. "A century ago, I warned this assembly that refusal would have consequences," she said. "Today, consequence has come speaking clearly. I advise all present to listen with more courage than your predecessors showed." The first delegate to support humanity openly was not nary. It was a species called the Edrin Combine, merchant scholars from a triple-moon world whose representatives had spent a century pretending that neutrality and profit were cousins rather than conspirators. Their envoy, pale and trembling in the blue light, stood and said the word genocide into the chamber record. One word. Then another envoy stood, then another. A process began. Not noble, not instant, but real. Reese requested recess, denied. Reese requested private consultation with Dominion Command. Granted, though everyone knew any message he sent was already part of the battlefield now. Cade did not object. In fact, she seemed to welcome it. The more the round command apparatus had to react under visible pressure, the more of itself it would reveal. While the chamber suspended formal speaking for consultation cycles, panic rolled through known space. Markets dipped, border fleets spun up, media nets fractured into denial, exhilaration, terror, and the kind of breathless certainty fools adopt whenever history turns faster than they can track. Some round citizens refused to believe the images were real. Some refused to believe the humans were real. Others, especially the young, reacted with something far more dangerous to the Dominion than fear. Questions. Why had they never been taught the full casualty totals? Why did archived school materials describe Saul as a disputed theater rather than a civilian civilization center? Why were named officers in the ledger still pensioned with honor? Why had the Senate classified so much war-era material for 100 years if the campaign had been lawful? Empires hate invading fleets. They fear informed children more. Within 6 hours of Cade's arrival, student protests had formed outside 3 Dominion historical institutes. Within 12, a retired round quartermaster published cargo record showing forced transfers of human industrial machinery from occupied worlds. Within 15, 2 former assembly staffers leaked internal memos proving several major delegations had possessed far stronger evidence of atrocity during the original debate than the public had ever been told. The century cracked everywhere at once. And above the tide chamber, the human ships did not move. That stillness became its own kind of pressure. If they had prowled, if they had aimed visible guns, if they had broadcast threats, the old powers might have rallied against the insult. But the black hulls simply waited, disciplined and close, like a sentence history had delayed too long. Talvin Reese spent his first consultation cycle speaking with the Dominion Strategic Corps, the second with the Senate War Secretariat, the third in silence, reviewing the targeted infrastructure list and demanding independent verification that humanity actually possessed the capacity to hit what it claimed. Verification came back ugly. Several listed vulnerabilities were already known internally, though buried in compartmented reports no outsider should have seen. One fuel lattice had not been publicly mapped in 34 years. One deep command vault did not officially exist. 2 antifold gate flaws were so recently discovered that only a handful of Dominion engineers had access, yet the human target package had them. When Reese returned to the chamber, the arrogance had not vanished, but it had been injured. "Suppose," he said, choosing each word like a blade he no longer trusted, "we grant recognition language and territorial restoration in principle. The tribunal demand is humiliation theater. No sovereign state surrenders its own commanders to enemies." Cade answered at once. "Then do not surrender them to enemies. Surrender them to law, unless you believe law stops at your border, in which case say that clearly into the record too." Some of the assembly delegates visibly winced. That was the trap they most feared: clear language, public language. A century earlier, vagueness had saved their reputations. Cade was removing vagueness from the room molecule by molecule. Reese pivoted. "And what of the thousands of round civilians who had no part in Saul? You threatened them with strategic strikes." Cade's stare hardened. "No, I threatened the machinery that taught them they could live above consequence forever. If I wished to do to your people what was done to mine, this conversation would not be happening." That mattered. Not because everyone believed her fully, but because deep down, almost everyone in the room did. Humanity had come with enough force to become nightmare. It had chosen terms instead. If the tension is building for you, save this video, subscribe before the fleet moves, and pass it to another sci-fi fan who loves slow-burn payoffs. Negotiations, if that was even the right word, dragged for 8 days. Not because the asks were unclear, because every institution involved had to decide whether it preferred justice, survival, or the illusion that one could still be postponed in favor of the other. The assembly formed emergency legal circles. The NARI hosted continuous session under exhaustion waivers. Human analysts fed Cade updated readouts on Dominion faction response, public unrest, and military mobilization. Leora Vale remained aboard Quiet Harbor, never appearing in the chamber, turning data into prediction with the concentration of a woman who had spent her entire life preparing to be useful on exactly these days. On day 2, 3 assembly delegations tried privately to persuade humanity to soften the tribunal demand in exchange for accelerated recognition and greater reparations. Cade declined. On day 3, Dominion hardliners proposed a decapitation strike on the human fleet, arguing that even if victory was uncertain, allowing public coercion would permanently weaken imperial prestige. Their own military killed the proposal before humanity needed to. The risk model was too catastrophic. Hidden human reserves were uncounted. The target package credibility was too high. The assembly system was too crowded. One wrong shot could light a multilateral war no one could contain. On day 4, the First Dominion City held an unauthorized vigil for human dead. That changed everything. Because once ordinary round citizens began grieving people their state had taught them not to see, the empire lost the clean moral distance it had leaned on for a century. Grief is contagious. So is shame. On day 5, Sarah asked Cade a question in private. "Do you hate them all?" Cade considered before answering. "No," she said, "that would have been easier." Sarah nodded as if that answer confirmed something she had hoped for and feared at the same time. On day 6, the Assembly archivist stood before the chamber and read the first formal recognition statement into galactic record. He used the word genocide 3 times. The Tide Chamber did not applaud. Applause would have been obscene, but the silence afterward felt different from the old silence. Not absence, witness. On day 7, the territorial restoration schedule was signed in principle. That part, surprisingly, came before the tribunal agreement. Not because land mattered more than blood. Because worlds could be mapped, evacuated, transferred, and rebuilt on paper faster than people could admit what kind of people they had been. The occupied human systems were in ugly condition. Some had been strip-mined nearly hollow. Some had been resettled by Dominion citizens generations removed from the original crime, people who now faced the terrifying truth that history had handed them homes with buried title. Some worlds had been turned into prison industry belts, their skies thick with refinery ash. Others held old human archives boxed and mislabeled in round museums under categories like frontier cultural residue. Cade demanded all of it back. Not because everything could be restored to what it had been. Because theft does not become ownership just because enough calendars pass. The assembly spent 20 straight hours arguing over phrases like managed transition, civilian protection standards, compensation pathways, and intergenerational occupancy claims. Humanity agreed to supervised resettlement corridors for uninvolved Dominion civilians, emergency aid, and non-retaliatory extraction windows. That concession mattered. It showed that the century in darkness had not erased the human ability to distinguish guilt from proximity. But Cade would not bend on sovereignty. "You do not heal a wound," she told the chamber, "by asking the knife to keep half the tissue." On day 8, the tribunal dispute finally cracked open. Not because Reese became moral. Because the Dominion became divided. A reform bloc in the Senate, smelling both danger and opportunity, concluded that sacrificing the oldest war architects might save the state itself. Military pragmatists agreed. Public sympathy was shifting. Archive leaks kept coming. The ledger's precision made denial structurally expensive. If the Empire refused every demand, it risked war from a human force whose full size no one could confirm, plus possible assembly alignment against it for the first time in living memory. So the reform bloc proposed a compromise. A limited tribunal. Only the most senior command officers. Only direct military actions. No industrial profiteers. No propagandists. No assembly collaborators. No colonial administrators. No legal theorists whose signatures transformed murder into policy language. In other words, the usual trick. Turn atrocity into a narrow military event, so society can keep pretending most of its hands were clean. Cade refused so quickly, the translators overlapped her. No. Reese bristled. Perfection is the enemy of settlement. Convenient proverb, Cade said. It tends to appear when the comfortable are asked to become accountable. He leaned closer to the speaking ring. You risk losing everything for excess. No, she said again. You are finally hearing what enough sounds like from the other side. There are moments when negotiations stop being about clauses and become about which moral universe will be allowed to survive the meeting. This was one of those moments. Then Leora Vale made her only public appearance. No one had expected it. She entered the chamber without ceremony, dressed in plain slate fabric, carrying no insignia at all. Many delegates did not recognize her face, but everyone recognized the change in Cade's posture. Respect, space, trust. Vale requested the record. The Nary granted it. For 100 years, she said, and unlike Cade, Vale spoke with almost no heat at all. We have organized information about what was done to us and who profited while it happened. Some in this chamber still believe the tribunal question is political theater. It is not. It is structural necessity. If you isolate guilt to a few uniforms, you will teach every future empire a useful lesson. Hide the planners behind law. Hide the beneficiaries behind markets. Hide the persuaders behind media distance. Hide the cowards behind procedure. Then, when the dead return in memory, hand over 3 old generals and call the wound addressed. No one interrupted her. Humanity did not spend a century surviving so that the galaxy could invent elegant ways to misunderstand mass murder again. She touched the hollow field. New files opened. Profit charts. Media dissemination webs. Insurance adjustment on seized human infrastructure. Assembly correspondence showing which delegations had privately acknowledged extermination while publicly pleading uncertainty. The room did not just see guilt, it saw systems. That was Vale's genius. Cade made people feel consequence. Vale made them understand design. And once people understand design, innocence becomes harder to perform. By the time Vale stepped back, the limited tribunal proposal was dead. On day 9, the Accords of Iscarvale were signed. The Round Dominion recognized the Saul Massacre and associated campaigns as genocide. The Galactic Assembly entered its refusal to intervene as a catastrophic moral failure and a breach of its stated civil order obligations. All occupied human territories were scheduled for phased restoration under monitored transfer. A 50-year reconstruction levy was imposed on the Dominion, not as punishment language, but as legally binding restorative obligation. And the tribunal was established with jurisdiction over military command, political authorization, economic exploitation, colonial administration, disinformation architecture, and complicit external facilitation. History rarely becomes just in a single room, but sometimes it becomes unable to keep lying in one. The moment the final seals locked, the tide chamber remained still. No cheering, no triumphant music, no grand military salute from the ships above. The humans did not celebrate because celebration would have implied completion. Cade only closed her eyes once. very briefly, as if somewhere inside her a century had loosened by 1 degree. Then she opened them and said the sentence the whole galaxy would spend generations quoting. This is not forgiveness. This is the minimum weight of memory. The Black Fleet left nary space 3 hours later. Again, that restraint mattered. Humanity did not linger to bask in fear. It did not tour assembly worlds like conquerors. It did not broadcast threats to the Dominion public. It got back to work. Because now the hardest phase began. Rebuilding. Retribution is simple compared to repair. Repair is slow, expensive, humiliating, and full of ordinary tasks that do not care how righteous you feel. Engineers had to assess atmospheres on worlds poisoned for generations. Farmers had to decide which soil could be saved and which must be remade from imported life. Archivists had to identify human relics scattered through foreign museums, private collections, military vaults, and black market caches. Psychologists had to help generations born in sealed habitats adjust to open skies they had inherited as legend. Children raised under perfect control suddenly had to learn weather. Some of them hated it. Open horizons made certain dark-raised humans nauseous. Wind felt like environmental failure. Rain caused panic in those who had never known water could fall from above without hull breach. On reclaimed Mars settlements, teachers held classes simply letting children stand beneath huge ceilings painted like clouds before they were ready for the actual thing. On a restored valley outside Old Nairobi, the first group of resettled families spent 2 weeks sleeping indoors with windows sealed, because the sound of insects made them think life support alarms were malfunctioning. Human survival had created a people adapted to confinement. Freedom, when it finally came, had to be relearned. Earth took longest, not because it was forgotten, because everyone wanted it too much. Too many myths had grown around it in the dark. Too many songs, too many lessons, too many simulations of oceans and forests and cities no one alive had fully remembered correctly. Returning to Earth meant colliding memory with reality, and reality was brutal. Coastlines were wrong. Storm belts had shifted. Several old equatorial zones were half-choked with invasive thermal bloom. Whole regions still carried the chemical ghosts of bombardment. Great urban foundations slept under silt or shallow inland seas. The orbital climate lattice had to be rebuilt almost from zero. And yet, when the first authorized civilian descent wave approached through repaired atmosphere, people cried at things no historian would have predicted. Cloud shadows, bird motion, the color green at continental scale. A woman from Station Ember, 82 years old and born in a pressure drum no wider than a cargo bay, stepped onto restored ground near the Andes and collapsed to her knees because dirt had a smell. She laughed and sobbed at the same time. Later, when asked what had overwhelmed her, she said, "It doesn't smell manufactured." That sentence was archived in 13 languages. If you're feeling that chill now, tap like, join the channel, and drop this into a group chat with someone who needs a reminder that patience can be terrifying. The tribunal opened 4 years after Iskar Vale. It lasted 11. No one came away satisfied, which may be the most honest sign that it mattered. Some round called it Victor's Law despite the fact that humanity had not conquered their homeworld. Some humans called it too soft because no sentence could make 16 billion lives return. Both criticisms held pieces of truth. Justice after atrocity is always imperfect because perfection would require resurrection. Still, the tribunal did what institutions almost never do unless forced. It named. Commanders stood and heard casualty counts attached to their signatures. Industrial magnates watched their profit ledgers paired with transport records from death zones. News architects who had buried extermination under euphemism were made to listen to their own archived phrasing while survivor testimony played beside it. Assembly delegates who had treated intervention as cost-benefit math were confronted with memoranda proving they understood exactly what refusal meant. One by one, the masks failed. Some defendants repented, more did not. Some hid behind obedience, others behind legality, a few behind the claim that history required hard actors. The tribunal answered all of them with the same merciless idea. If your order depends on the planned destruction of civilians, then what you built was not order. The most dramatic moment did not come from a sentence. It came from Talvin Reese. He had not been in command during Saul. Legally, his culpability was not equal to the architect's, but he had spent a career preserving the crime in public memory as necessity. When called to testify regarding state concealment, he was offered the usual path powerful people are offered. Distance yourself, blame the dead, preserve the institution. Instead, after 6 hours under cross-rec, examination, and confronted with internal Dominion files he had once helped classify, Reese said something no one expected. "We believed endurance belonged to us," he said. "We thought history was made by those willing to be cruel first. What I see now is that we were not stronger, only less answerable. We mistook delayed consequence for innocence." It was not absolution, but it was true. His statement accelerated reforms inside the Dominion more than any external pressure could have. School texts changed, memorial law changed, archive access changed. There were backlash movements, of course. There always are, but the old clean lie could no longer dominate uncontested. Meanwhile, humanity's internal transformation continued. The generation born in silence began arguing with the generation who had created it. That conflict was inevitable. Children who grew up after Iskar Vale asked hard questions. Why had so much been hidden from ordinary citizens in the dark network? Why were some retaliatory missions never acknowledged? Why had certain suspected perpetrators disappeared before the tribunal could reach them? Why were military archives still sealed on events the official histories insisted were settled? The elders, to their credit, did not always defend themselves well. Some said secrecy had been survival. It had. Some said not every ugly thing deserved preservation. That was more doubtful. Mara Sarin, old now but still sharp, argued publicly that if humanity had demanded the galaxy face its full record, then humanity must do the same with its own century in darkness. Memory that edits only enemies, she said, eventually becomes propaganda wearing mourning clothes. That sentence changed curriculum across 3 human worlds. It also angered many veterans. Good. A living civilization should be harder to satisfy than a marching one. Cade retired 7 years after the Accords, which shocked everyone except those who had truly understood her. She had never wanted to become permanent. She remembered Ven's wall. Build systems that do not need your ghost. Her last official act was not military. She chaired the transfer of the final occupied school archive on Ganymede back to human cultural authorities, then spent an hour alone inside a room full of children's drawings recovered from sealed storage. Planets with smiling faces, houses under blue skies, rockets bigger than mountains, a family portrait labeled home in handwriting preserved under polymer dust for a century. When she emerged, an aide asked what the room had been like. Cade said, louder than war. After retirement, she vanished from public life so completely that conspiracy cultures invented a dozen false sightings. A monastery under Europa ice, a farm on Earth's restored coast, a command advisory role in deep fleet black sites, a quiet apartment overlooking a reclaimed river. The truth, when it finally came out after her death, was both simpler and more fitting. She taught navigation to adolescents on a civilian academy vessel that spent most of its route carrying students between newly reopened worlds. The woman,